It might sound obvious, but the water needs to stay outside the boat. And an idea of this afternoon's lesson is just that. Interesting how the mind works and how lessons evolve. I had a plan of a lesson to bring this week. You'll probably see it some other week because I never got that one because these others came in front of it. So just happened to come through the way this one just kind of hit me. So I'm like, okay, let's go with it then. Started thinking about it and found a couple of examples of why the water needs to stay outside the boat. So obviously for a boat to stay afloat, the water needs to be on the outside, not on the inside. We all know what happened to the Titanic when too much water got inside the boat. We know what happens to our paddle boats or our canoes or something else out on the lake when too much water. You don't put that drain plug in at the back. That's not a good thing. You're not going to be driving around for very long. We need to do the same thing for ourselves. We need to keep the things that will make us sink, also known as sin, outside of us. So as we think about water in the boat on this one, the water is not good to be inside the boat. For our spiritual bodies, we need to keep sin outside of us. Looking at Isaiah 43, first part of verse 2 says, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow you." The rest of the verse changes its illustration to say, "When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you." I'm sure that second half was very comforting to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they got thrown in the fiery furnace. For our illustration, I'm just looking at that first part about, and there's so many other verses. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me." It's a process. When you pass through, as we go through this life, we need to try and keep the waters outside. One of those elements that we can think about, and one of the prime examples, might be Genesis chapter 6 through 8. We have the ark that Noah built. Why did he build an ark? He built it to keep the water outside, to be safe on the inside. Now, he was given very specific instructions. And as we look at those instructions, we go through, we don't have all of the blueprints that God gave him. We don't have all of the directions that he said. We see the overview of it, but Noah had the detailed instructions, and he followed them. I can say that very knowingly because in Genesis 6, verse 22, "Thus did Noah, according to all that God commanded him, so he did." He followed the directions. He put the front of the ship at the front of the ship. He put the back where the back's supposed to be. He made the right number of levels. He used the right wood. He set it up just right. Everything was done to seal the boat, to make sure that it would float. I could only imagine working 100 years on this in an area where they're like, "What are you doing?" In an area where this is the biggest water vessel probably on earth right now. Everything, fishing boat. What kind of fish you going to pick up with that thing? It seemed like a monstrous task. The only thing that he did not do himself was close the door. When God said, "It is time," they went in. He only brought in what was authorized. We see that it stayed afloat. God, gave all these directions. He gave all this process. God closed the door after Noah and his family were safe on board. They walked in, the animals were in, and it was all done. Chapter 7, verse 23, we see the safety where so God destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping things and birds of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. He kept the water out. He kept the sin and the bad things out of the ark. The ark door was open to anyone who would hear. While he was building, he was trying to preach to those around him and get them all involved, get them all in. Nobody volunteered. He didn't grab anyone kicking and screaming. He only opened the door and let those that wanted in. Because he only brought in what was authorized, it stayed afloat. In verse 15 of chapter 8, it says that then God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you." We see the authorized. His family decided to be respectful and follow God, and they were on the ark. When the time came, they were able to get out of the boat without falling in the waters. We have another example in the Old Testament of Jonah. Now, I've used Jonah quite a few times, but I'm going to use him at least one more. I'm sure there'll be more in the future, but in this particular case, when we think about water in the boat, you've got to say Jonah. He tried to run and hide from God, and he tried doing it using a boat. That didn't work too well. As we look at Jonah, he was given a task to do for God, but instead he ran away. Starting in chapter 1, verse 1, "Now when the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa, found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord." It always amazes me, and something I picked up on quickly, is every time he went somewhere away from God, he was going down. We see this after he gets thrown overboard in a little bit, but before that he was given a task and he ran away. He allowed sin into himself. And it works so good for this example because as we go forward, we get into verse 4, "But the Lord sent out a great wind on the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship was about to be broken up." For shipping and for all these ships going back and forth, they don't like these bad weather storms. They don't like it when the water is so bad that it's about to go into their boats and try and drown them, sink them. When they're jumping back and forth and about to be broken up, because of this extra baggage, because of the sin that Jonah brought with him into all this, into the boat, everyone was in danger. That's another good study in itself, is that it's not just about me and my sin, it's about everyone else around me. Jonah put others in danger. Now, verse 5 hits it pretty clearly. The mariners were afraid. These are professionals. There's not just some hobby person going out playing with the boat. This is someone who, this is their life profession. When they get scared, that's when it's time to start being a little scared. You know, if it's just, the boat's just kind of doing this and they're just walking around like normal, it's like, oh, okay. You know, it might be scary to me. I'm used to solid ground. When they walk around like, meh, I don't have to worry yet. When I see them get frantic, what you need help with so that we can make it to the next spot? Put me to work. They were afraid. So we get to see that the sins of this one man endangered all. Verse 9, And part of this, they start reaching out to who are their gods and, all of these things that they tried to do, but finally gets down to verse 9. So he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Jonah knew who God was. He knew the power that God had, but yet he disobeyed him in the first place. He ran from the command he was given. I think if he's that powerful, I don't think you're outrunning him. Verse 10, then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, why have you done this? For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord because he told them. They were already afraid up in verse 5. Now they're exceedingly afraid. Now they know why these winds and these bad things are happening. If we go back and look at verse 5, we see what these men tried to do is when the storm was hitting them and beating them up so much. In verse 5 it says that they threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten the load. That's their livelihood. They are shipping materials back and forth for money so that they can survive and they can live, and they just throw it overboard. You don't do that on a whim. They were that afraid. They were saying, our lives are worth more. We will pay the consequences later. But if we finish that verse, it says, but Jonah had gone down into the lowest parts of the ship, had lain down, and was fast asleep. Verse 12 says, and he said to them, pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will become calm for you, for I know that this is the great tempest is because of me. Sometimes we need to throw out the water. We need to get the water out of the boat. We need to get what's pulling us down out. They already tried the cargo. That didn't work. Jonah says it's because of me. Now, of course, men are like, well, you're crazy. We're not throwing you out of the boat. We're not throwing anyone overseas into this water. If someone goes over the boat, we usually try and pull you back in. But finally, in verse 15, they came back around to it, so they picked up Jonah, threw him in the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. I think it's important to notice that the men feared the Lord exceedingly and offered a sacrifice to the Lord and took vows. When we put the wrong stuff in the boat, it causes issues. When we allow things to come into our lives or into us that don't need to be there, it causes issues. And not always just for us. Sometimes our families feel the consequences. Sometimes people that we don't even know. These men, Jonah didn't even know these men. He put their lives in danger because we let the wrong thing in the boat. Third example I have, we're going to go up to the New Testament. Mark chapter 4, we see Jesus inside of a boat with his disciples and possibly others, and they are headed from one spot to another. I think it interesting is that, if anyone is going to be safe, I would want to travel with Jesus. I would want to travel with him, with the Son of Man, because I'm pretty certain wherever he's going to make it there safely. Especially if I've been with him for a little while. I've seen the miracles that he's done. I've heard the teachings that he's done. And he does everything and is always safe. Even when he ruffles feathers, he's still safe. No one touches him. Why would I be afraid of a little bit of wind? Starting in verse 35, we see on the same day when evening had come, he said to them, let us cross over to the other side. Now when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and the other little boats also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. But Christ, he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. This storm is enough to push water into the boat. It's enough to toss them around and start beating them around a little bit, making everyone up topside nervous. And where's Jesus? Funny, it's in the same spot that they found Jonah. Down and asleep. My first thought is, if the Son of Man is not worried about the storm, should I? Look at what happened to Peter when he says, "Master, is that you?" after they got over being scared about it being a ghost. "If it is you, call to me and I will come." And he jumped out of the boat and walked on water to Jesus until he saw the winds blowing. Jesus heard the winds blowing. He knew it was over there. He kept walking on the water. Where are we focused? If the boat would have filled up to a dangerous level, the stern where he was found at would probably turn into a bit of a waterbed. And if you had a nice sleep going and all of a sudden you're filled with water, you usually wake up if it got that bad. But they were fearful. He was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. They awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" If they couldn't handle the situation, I think he would care. Perhaps it was a little bit of a test. Sometimes we do get splashed with water. Sometimes we got to turn on the sunk pump. Sometimes we got to take a bucket and do it the old-fashioned way, start scooping and throwing it out. Sometimes we need to have faith. As we look at it, they were fearful instead of being faithful, and that made a difference. Then he arose and rebuked the wind, said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. There was a calm outside the boat, but now we got to have a little bit of a storm inside the boat. But he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" I'd say the storm just turned out to be inside now. You're going to tell everyone in the boat, his closest disciples even, "Why are you fearful? Where is your faith?" And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, "Who can this be, that even the wind and sea obey him?" Where was the faith? You imagine just uttering those three words, and a rough sea that was throwing water in the boat and had everyone scared just all of a sudden went calm. Everything was peaceful. Except for the people in the boat. They were still a little scared about that when all of a sudden this man just controlled the weather. Sometimes we need to be the one leaving the water outside the boat. Thinking about this lesson made me think back to childhood a little bit, growing up. Have you ever been in a canoe or a kayak or a small boat of any kind? You know that not everyone goes to one side at the same time. It kind of gets a little lopsided and usually goes under them. Sometimes we did it on purpose. Sometimes we didn't. We just forgot and we were like, "Oh, branch." And everyone turned this way and the canoe went bloop. And now you're trying to find yourself, your paddle, your canoe, and any gear you had inside. Sometimes it may seem like everyone around us is trying to capsize our boat. Our job is to stay with God through all things. Sometimes the wind and the waves and everything else are hard to deal with. But we're given an example inside of 2 Peter of several who were surrounded by shark-infested waters, as this illustration might put it. But they kept themselves afloat. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 11, we have that one person standing out, that one person staying in the boat when there's signs all around that say, don't get in the water. For God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them to the chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. And he did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly. And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterwards would live ungodly. And delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked, for that righteous man dwelled among them, tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment, and especially for those who walk according to the flesh in the lust and uncleanness and despise authority. They are presumptuous, self-willed. They are not afraid to speak evil of dignitaries, whereas angels who are greater in power and might do not bring a reviling accusation against them before the Lord. Multiple cases here in 2 Peter chapter 2 where he says this whole area, the world before at the time of Noah, 8 people were all that got on the ark. So much so that it grieved God, but he saw righteousness in one man. Sodom and Gomorrah, but one family got out. Look at these cases here where even if the world around us is crumbling, reaching over with buckets of water and dumping them in the boat, our job is to stand for God. Are we focused correctly to keep the water outside the boat? Do we have the right focus in mind? Philippians 4, verse 6 and 7, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And here's the focus part. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. As we looked at this morning, are we empty? Are we missing something? Maybe right now we're one of those that are aimlessly wandering around and don't know everyone doesn't need to run to one side of the boat. At one point, I didn't know that. I found out quick. I learned it. Now I know how to balance in a boat. They also tell you don't stand up in a canoe, but I've learned how to do that too if I need to. It's not always a good idea. You want to stay a little bit lower. We learn these things to be able to keep the water outside so that we can stand up when the time is right. It wouldn't have been a great lesson that Jesus gave when he was out on the shore of the multitudes and he asked for the boat, bring me out a little ways so I could speak to the people, if they didn't know to keep the water out of the boat. You'd have had a preacher that kept on sinking, getting shorter and shorter, and I think his message would have been lost. Sometimes going out on the boat, we usually, going canoeing and going out, we'd have a boat buddy. We'd have 2 boats that kind of paired up. That way, if I had an issue, they could help me. We need to have the right buddies. We need to have the right people in the boat. We need to educate others about how to keep water out of the boat. It's a very good thing if you have a plug on the back of the boat, make sure that plug goes in before you put it in the water. You can't put it in afterwards. It don't work that well. Let's help each other keep the water outside the boat. Let's keep ourselves filled with what it needs to be filled with so that nothing is missing. So that we can move on and we can continue to grow and not spend so much time Maybe our boat is filled with some water. It needs to be cleaned out. Let's spend the right time cleaning it out instead of it continuing to pull us down. The invitation is open to any who need it. If you have things inside your boat, inside your soul that don't need to be there, let's work together to help purge those out. Let's clean it out. Let's turn on that pump and let it drain out. If our boats are empty, rejoice in that. Let's keep pushing forward. Let's keep watching for leaks. Let's continue to support one another. As we continue through this service, as we continue through our lives, let's continue to help one another. If there's any need that we can offer assistance with at this time, please let us know while together we stand and sing.